Hey guys, thanks for tuning in again. We're back with a fresh new haircut, bringing the best videos of the week right on your device. And today's video is all about the wrist mobility, how to avoid wrist injuries and pain, and we'll give you several of drills which you can do and introduce into your mobility routine or into your training routine. So enjoy this video a lot.
So let's have a closer look at when wrist injuries happen and why they happen. Number one, they happen when we don't have or overuse our tissues used in any exercise, basically. So when we overuse the tissues, what do I mean by that? When for example, we just use the handstand now. When I go into a handstand without having adequate prerequisites, i.e. wrist extension, then that will lead to injuries or pain in my wrist. So there is no way out of that. I need to have the prerequisites, so active range of motion, at least 90-degree wrist extension in order to safely perform a handstand without injuring my wrist. And that same applies to something like a push-up. That same applies for when I do false grip hangs or false grip pull-ups, false grip muscle-ups, whatever, all of that hanging stuff. So that requires a certain amount of wrist mobility as well. And it also applies to things like a planche. When we're in a planche, we need even more wrist extension than in a push-up or in a handstand. And then when we look at the bridge and we do certain things in the bridge, we might need even more wrist extension as well. So as you can see, there are a lot of things that we need to consider when going through a movement or an exercise. It's not only about, do I have the strength in my muscles to do a push-up? It's also about, do I have the prerequisites in my joints to do that movement? And that's where we divide between, do I injure myself or do I stay healthy and happy and strong? So I hope it's clear to you that what we're talking about is not injuries where you fall on your wrist and break your bones, but injuries that can be prevented by knowing your body and knowing what your body is capable of. So having enough wrist extension, wrist flexion, wrist rotation, whatever, in order to do what you want to do, and not when you accidentally fall on your wrist and then you break your bones or whatever, or a ligament, then obviously that's unavoidable at that moment. But there are things that can be avoided to avoid injuries and pain. So what can we do and how can we know whether or not we have sufficient range of motion, active control over our wrist extension or wrist flexion in this case? And we want to show you a little test that you can do at home basically to make sure that you know where you're at with your wrist mobility. So when we go for wrist extension in this case, then you want to make sure that you have a 90-degree angle in your elbow, and then your elbow is glued to your rib cage. And from here, have your hand neutral, and then try to extend your hand as much as possible. And so he's at like basically almost 90 degrees. He should be, because he's doing handstands, or he's at 90 degrees. So he's allowed to do handstands from my perspective. He's allowed to do it. He's also allowed to do things like push-ups. But what about planche leans? I wouldn't tell him to do planche related training with that wrist extension. So there you see. And when you have wrist extension that ends here, but you want to do push-ups and handstands, you're going into a range of motion that you have no active control over, no strength in, and even if you have the passive range of motion, you have no motor control in that range of motion. If something happens, then shit comes together and you will injure yourself. There is no way out of it, okay? So that's for wrist extension. We can do the same test basically, taking our forearm around 180 degrees and then try to go into wrist flexion. And again, we have a 90-degree angle. We try to get our elbow close to our rib cage and then try to go in as much wrist flexion as we can. And again, that's a nice 90-degree angle. So we can probably say we're safe to go for something like false grip hangs. We can safely do pull-ups and stuff like that, just to keep that in mind. So these are two simple tests that you can do at home and see whether or not you have adequate range of motion. If you do not have adequate range of motion, then the next mobility video or exercises that we're going to show you are going to help you a lot. And if you do have the range of motion but feel like you don't have enough control over your wrist or enough strength in that range of motion, then you can probably skip the next 2 exercises and go towards the end of the video where we show you more strengthening exercises.
So after you did the test and you found out that you don't have sufficient passive range of motion, so what I mean by that is if you pressed your hand into wrist extension and your hand stopped, let's say before 90 degrees, and you had pain or not a good feeling there, uncomfortable feeling, then you will most likely don't have the passive range of motion. So what that means is we have to apply pails and rails, also passive stretching with some isometric components to get you more passive range of motion, but also try to actively control that newly acquired range of motion, of course. So the wrist extension pails and rails, for example, could look like that. So go here in this position, in this kneeling position, then lean over your wrist until you feel a stretching sensation in the opening side. If you have that sensation without having pain in this closing angle, then it's perfect for you to be there and stretch out for 2 minutes or longer to really get that feedback to that central nervous system. And after the 2 minutes, we apply the isometrics, which you already hopefully been used to after watching a lot of videos of us or FRC. Then you apply the pails and rails. Pails would be pushing your hand back into the ground as hard as you can for 15 seconds. And the rails would be 15 seconds trying to lift off basically the upper palm and the fingers towards your forearm, really trying to close that angle even more and engaging all the forearm muscles here. So this one should be done at least 2 to 3 times during the week to get enough time and attention to actually change something there. And you should do it for weeks and months before you can progress towards more advanced stuff, because this takes time, right? Opening passive range of motion and the active control over that newly acquired passive range of motion takes time. Okay, so don't forget about that. If you found out after the test that you have sufficient passive range of motion but lack the active control, so you have actually a gap between active and passive, then we highly recommend you to do some, for example, passive range holds like she's doing now, or some passive range liftoffs, which are actually even harder and more demanding on the active control side, and you will close that gap with for these two drills, for example. So you can do that also as well. I highly recommend you, if you have a gap between active and passive, then you should do it as also 2 to 3 times a week, most likely. And you could also apply the same stuff I talked about now with wrist flexion. If you have problems with your false grip, and especially with the active control of your wrist flexion, then use the same stuff here for wrist flexion. Go back here, try to find a stretch here in this opening side, and you can do the pails and rails right there in this position as well. And with the upcoming exercise now, we will strengthen your wrist even more, so you will have bulletproof wrists to avoid future injuries. The first exercise is CARs. CARs are such a great tool to not only assess your wrist if you have issues with your wrist, but also training your full range of motion of your wrist. And this is not easy. This is not just joint circles for your wrist. This is hard mobility work, working through your full range of motion. So we have one option, which we usually do when we do a morning CARs with less intensity, but we go through the full range of motion and not do sloppy joint circles. So for this one, again, 90-degree angle in your elbow, then elbow glued to your rib cage, and block your wrist from moving to the side with the other hand, so really grab it hard. And from here, we go through the full range of motion, go up into wrist flexion, then to the side, and open up again in wrist extension, then in ulnar deviation, and up into wrist flexion. And we'll do that 2 times clockwise, 2 times counterclockwise, and really fight for the biggest circle you can, and without letting your wrist tilt to the side or open up, okay? We can do this a lot harder to even strengthen your wrist even more as a mobility training. By using a block, for example, we can do both wrists simultaneously, or we can lay our hand on a block and really block our wrist even more from doing any kind of movements. And we use the same exercise, but now with more intensity, and spread more tension into that wrist with your breath work, with your breath technique. And now it's much harder. She has to fight for an even bigger circle, and that's how you can train your wrist through your full range, through its full range of motion. And this is really hard and tough.
Okay, we've made it to the last part, which is strengthening our wrists. And when we strengthen our wrists, we don't only want to strengthen the wrist itself, but we're also strengthening our forearms. And when it comes to the wrist, it's like when we did, it's like any other joint except for the spine, basically. We also need to focus on rotation of the wrist, which is why we did the CARs. So it's not only about extension and flexion, but there's also rotational movement that we need to take into account. So when we start with this, we'll start with wrist push-ups because it's the easiest, and we start in a quadruped position, because the closer we are, or the more we are in a quadruped or kneeling position, the less stress and the less weight we have on our hands or on our wrists. And the more we go into a plank position, the more weight we have on our wrists. So we start in a plank, and then from here we want to make sure...
A plank?
We start in a quadruped position, so tabletop position. We want to make sure shoulder is over our, right over our wrist, and our elbow is straight. From here, take a deep breath in, engage your core, and then you basically just try to get onto your fingers and down. So you stay on your full fingers and then go down, and that's how you do the push-ups, making sure that your shoulder stays always over your wrist and you do not lean back, because if you lean back during the push-up, that means this exercise or this progression is too hard for you, and you need to compensate by leaning back with the shoulder in order to get that wrist push-up, okay? So then just make this a little bit easier by going even further forward with the knees.
So this last exercise we show you is for radial deviation and ulnar deviation, and it's also these are also push-ups performed in the same with the same progressions like the wrist flexion and wrist extension push-ups, but we will do it from the fist and rock forward to get a good stretch here, and then back, fully controlled, yes, as far back as we can, and then forward again. Try to make sure you have enough body tension here, no loose muscles, and you can progress your way until you are in a plank position. So, as we said, keep in mind there's not always or only wrist flexion and extension, but also rotational capacities of your wrist that has to be targeted in order to get a better wrist mobility. Also keep in mind that the strengthening exercise should be the last progression and the last step in building up a strong wrist, right? Before we do come to or introduce these exercises into your training, please make sure you have actually built up good passive range of motion with the pales and rails we showed you, or with other wrist stretches, right? And then the active control through advanced stuff like the passive range holds, passive range lift offs, and then at the final step, these wrist strengthening drills, right? So there's no shame to do the basics a lot more than this fancy looking wrist mobility stuff, because it's much more important to actually be in your end range and stretch it out there and activate it with isometrics and really strengthen your end range than trying to do the wrist push-ups and maybe get pain there because you actually don't have built up the prerequisites prior to these exercises, right? All these exercises you saw at the end, you can do prior to any push or pulling routine, for example, and you can just do 2 sets of all these exercises with 6 to 8 repetitions. So you have a good guideline where and how much you should apply these exercises, right? So yeah, that's it for this video. I hope you liked my new haircut and all the information we gave you. Please leave us a like or subscribe our channel. If you have questions, please comment down below. We will love to answer that, and we love to hear your feedback of the video. And if it helps you, or if you had wrist injuries and how you rehabbed it, it's also very interesting for us to see different approaches. And yeah, thanks for tuning in again, and we'll see you in the next one.